Welcome to another broadcast of Philosophic Perspectives with Arthur D. Schwartz on the ArtistFirst Radio Network. All past broadcasts are archived for free downloading. Visit the archive sections at ArtistFirst.com. And now your host, Arthur D. Schwartz.
Hello, everybody. Nice to have you back again. Today we're going to get really basic. We're going to talk about the self. You really can't get too much more basic than that, right? Because, think of the world without, being yourself. It's kind of difficult to even imagine. But in philosophy, of course, we like to really delve into basic concepts such as the self. It has a metaphysical aspect to it, a psychological aspect to it, a neurological aspect. It's actually a paradigm of philosophy because I like to say that there's nothing more real than the self because that's our reality, ourselves, right? That's who we are. But there's nothing more unreal than the self because, let's face it, are we the same self that within your mother's womb or as an infant or through childhood and on through life? We change so much. And yet, the idea of the self is something that oftentimes is what we hold most dear. So there's many different aspects and angles, perspectives you can take on this subject. It has an egoistic and altruistic dimension. It's like very illusory, as I was talking about. I just explained how the self is very, very changeable over time. But at the same time, in philosophy or certain branches of philosophy, it's considered to be immutable. The one thing that doesn't change is the self. What a paradox when we think about how changeable it is in other respects. Other issues come into play about ourselves and our material possessions. Does materialism or non-materialism affect the self? Do circumstances, situations, culture change the self? On the surface, it certainly does if you're born in another part of the world. If you're born rich or you're born poor, if you're educated or uneducated. So all these things come into it. And there's a wide, broad dimensionality of the self. But one of the basic perspectives we have on the subject has to do with the dichotomy between Eastern and Western philosophy. We think of those two areas of philosophy, in terms of the development historically, of having a very, very different perception of what actually is the self. Well, I have a special guest tonight, Fred Loeb. He's someone I've known for quite a few years, and I'm really impressed with his knowledge on Eastern philosophy. And I think he is somebody who you're going to learn much from tonight in terms of his understanding and his perceptions and his insight into the subject. And so this is going to be a conversation about the self from an East and West perspective. And so at this time, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce my friend and guest tonight, Fred Loeb. How you doing, Fred?
All right. How are you doing tonight, Arthur?
I'm doing great. Doing great.
Thanks for having me on.
Oh, my pleasure. So, we've talked a lot about subjects like this. And what do you think about the idea of the self being an illusory thing? Is it illusory, do you think, or is it sort of is there a true self?
I'm not really sure. I guess early on in my life, I always thought the self was a pretty permanent thing, that I had a certain identity, a certain contrast between me, what I considered me, and the world around me, and also something that really couldn't change. I had some kind of a nature, if you will, that was the way I was, and it wouldn't change much. I guess after studying Eastern philosophy, I started to have a different concept of the self. one that was changeable, yet at the same time had an intrinsically good nature to it. And also one that wasn't as separate from the world around me as I would have believed. And I felt that these concepts were very different than the way I felt earlier in my life. So I assumed that there was no way that they were part of any kind of a Western philosophical view on the self. But again, this was just an assumption on my part, because of maybe due to language difference, or the way the subject matter is presented in Eastern philosophy was a little different than what I had experienced in my everyday life. Not being a scholar of Western philosophy by any stretch, I couldn't say for sure if it was the schools of Western philosophy that gave me those feelings, or just my surroundings. So I've been contemplating the self for a long time, and my views on the self have changed dramatically. Let's say over the past 25 years or so, since I've been studying Eastern philosophy.
Mm-hmm. Well, one could say that your changing perception of what the self is might have perhaps influenced yourself. That was a pun. but I mean, honestly, having a changing perception of the idea of the self can actually change the self in certain ways. Human beings, we're self-reflective. Philosophy is all about reflection, self-reflection, particularly, but reflection in general. And I'm just wondering, it just occurred to me when you're talking about the irony of changing perceptions on the self. Does that have any impact on your particular self? Of course, I think you're saying your view was that it was with getting into Eastern philosophy. Your view was that the self was more unchangeable, correct? Than previous.
Yes and no. I think that there was a nature, maybe in Buddhism it might be called a Buddha nature, and in some other schools it might be called a true nature, in which that isn't necessarily something changeable, but also something that's not necessarily unique to me, identifying me, Arthur. Something that is said that everyone possesses. Buddha nature and a true self, that at that level, the level of Buddha nature or the level of true self, that we're all more alike than different. So therefore not necessarily something identified particularly with me. You had mentioned the illusory nature of self, and I believe that that's the other part. So where I said, yes, it did seem to be something that's not changing, that would be more like the Buddha nature, but this illusory part is where it's no. There is a change there, because in something like Buddhism, there's what are considered the four lakshana of self, which are self, human being, sentient being, and soul. All of these particular attributes are considered that they arise from self-clinging. Mm-hmm. So clinging to a particular identity. Mm-hmm.
Well,
so in terms of what you were talking about before with, the self being somewhat illusory, I think that that identification and the extreme case being ego is just that. It's somewhat of an illusion.
Right, and I was pointing out, the different aspects of what we consider to be the self, the metaphysical or the psychological, the egoistic, or it's something that's more transcendent. Sometimes I think this talking about the self comes very close to talking about the idea of the soul, I think. Ooh. And so, but I'd like to ask you, so do you feel that the commonality of the self that you're talking about, and it's not necessarily distinct, and on some, at least some, one of those points of view, towards the self, that is there just one self, a universal self that we're all part of, or are they individuated?
My recent belief is there's a concept in Buddhism called the alaya vijnana, or the storehouse consciousness. Uh-huh. And I believe that there is that's somewhere where we're all connected, and if there is any particular soul, that it's something that continues in this this storehouse consciousness, mm-hmm. and that is somewhere where we're all somewhat connected and the same in a way. So I see this as something that we all have, and when we try to explore, when I try to explore true nature or Buddha nature, I find that it's not only an internal investigation, but an external investigation in terms of discussion and interaction with other people. That in order for me to get some kind of a view of what the true self is, or the Buddha nature is something that I can't necessarily do on my own, although it does require self-reflection from time to time.
Well, is it possible that these different breakdowns of the of the word self? I mean, we're using the word self to describe this perspective or this aspect or this quality, but is it possible that in some way we're talking about different things, and are they actual entities? Is entity the wrong sense of it? Because if it's part immutable and part changeable and illusory, and part maybe can die if it's the part that is contingent on ego. So certainly that can die, whereas another part may never die. And the question would be, are we talking about, is it possible that we're actually talking about, in some sense, different things? Or is the idea of the self something that is a logically specific construct that you're referring to, one, to use the word thing, in quotes, because we're not talking about a material thing, but, one entity, one subject is the self? Or is it possible that they're just aspects of something, of consciousness, or something along those lines?
Mm. There was a lot in there, Arthur, and I think that I guess my response to that is I think that there's, I'm not sure about entity, but if we want to consider something beyond, let's say, just one individual person. So for example, if I consider myself, of course, an individual, but I feel that I have a very close relationship with my family, my wife and children. And I see that as almost being a unit, and therefore, expanding that notion of entity to be inclusive of my entire family. And if I extend that family, I would consider people like my parents and my brothers and my brother and my sisters. I don't see my family much, and my father's no longer with us. But that family still goes on.
Right.
So that family is immutable in a sense. In my being, in my so I think things may seem to change over time, and may change based on perspective. Mm-hmm. But I wonder if there isn't always an element that remains, and that there's something to that remaining immutable element that gives us a glimpse of what Buddha nature or true self might be like. I don't know if that was clear.
Well, I mean, that's what we're wrestling with. I mean, there's something about the self that we really want to be a continuity. Again, we're the same self, arguably, that we were when we were an embryo, right?
Ooh.
And then an infant, and then into childhood and into teens and adult, various stages of adulthood. I like the. I don't think this is my example, but I think I read it somewhere. But if you went back and if you're able to go back in time, so let's say you're 50 years old, and so you go back in time to to meet yourself when you were 7, and you go back in time to meet yourself when you're 7. And you also meet other people, and you become friends with other people you can really relate with, or your own age, more or less, and have similar experiences and similar likes and dislikes and interests and so forth and so on. And who do you have more in common with? Your new acquaintance, who's your own age in terms of your chronological development, because you're a time traveler, or your actual self, who's a 7-year-old kid. Where is the closer proximity to the friend you just met, who you have a lot in common with, or your very self, or should I say your very same self? Maybe that's not the right way to put it. Maybe it's yourself, but not your same self. But so that's the question I think we struggle with. I think self has to have something ingrained that's a continuity. We want, because it's our self-identity. If we didn't have a sense of self, wouldn't we really? The world would be more difficult even than it is, because every day, every moment of every day, you would have nothing to fall back on. For example, conscience. A conscience. I guess accepting psychopaths. Most people have a conscience, and we fall back on that as a construct that would prevent us from doing certain things. For example, on many different levels, and but if there was no self, there really wouldn't be able to. You wouldn't have a conscience. Really, wouldn't be possible, or would it? What do you think? I mean, could you have a conscience without having a self?
I don't know. It doesn't seem like you could, but I think that some of conscience is part of what, as I looked at Eastern philosophy, I think one of the things that I found was comforting to me was I found comfort in the elements of the self that seem to be immutable. There's Buddha nature or true nature. But I also found a lot of comfort in that other parts can change. And you bring up conscience, and that's an interesting topic. Because, we have actions, we do things in the world, and maybe, we have a bad string of luck, or, something might have happened, or maybe, we didn't react well in a few different situations along our life. And there's a time, especially when you're young, where you can feel that, well, that's just the way I am. This is what I can expect for the rest of my life. These are the kinds of things that happen to me because that's the kind of person I am. And I think that, so sometimes, conscience can be, a tough thing to deal with, because if you ruminate on something,
right,
something that you've done in the past, you may think, well, I'm just an awful person. And it must just be the way I am, and I'll never be any different. So, I might as well just get used to it. As opposed to say, no, there are those elements that seem to be somewhat negative. I struggle to believe that they're part of my true nature or my Buddha nature. And the only reason I say that is that any evidence that we have, or any stories or any depictions that we have of enlightened beings all seem to be pretty peaceful and happy. And I think that's a good thing, Arthur.
I think
you only
so.
imagine if they had horrid looks on their faces. And, so they've been enlightened to the way things really are, and if they were wincing in pain or had some kind of big fear face on, I mean, that would be a tough thing to deal with. But I think that, but yet, so I do find that there's comfort to know that that there are certain elements of what I might identify myself as that will change. I think there's a comfort in that, and I think there's also a comfort in understanding that the titles and the names that go along with some of the stages of life, that it's healthy to let them go.
Right.
It's healthy to let them go and to move on. And I think that in Buddhist literature, where they talk about no self, that's what they're referring to. They're referring to the self that comes along with the provisional names that we tend to give things, like titles and names that go along with relationship and things of that nature. Right? I mean, so if hopefully this is not going to happen for a long time, but my father is already gone. If my mother dies in the future, I'm still a son. Mm-hmm. Right. But yet at the same time, if you're so hung up on that relationship or that thing having to fit a certain identity, I think that's the clinging that is the suffering referred to in Buddhism. It's the thing that you're trying to avoid. It's like, things will cause pain, things will cause you to experience pain, but the suffering is the clinging to wanting it to be different.
Yeah, I think you're touching on the subject of, I know it's a big subject in Buddhism, particularly attachment, and it might be. We're going to take a break in just a minute here, but I think perhaps we can return to this subject as a way of clarifying perhaps what the self might be by way of a process of elimination, almost, when you think about detachment, detaching yourself from this, and perhaps when you get to that thing you can't actually detach from, maybe that's where the self exists. So that's just a thought. So we're going to take a short break. Stay where you are. We'll be back shortly.
Hi, everybody. This is Ron Chepstick, the producer and host of Crime Beat Radio, which airs every Thursday in the ArtistFirst Radio Network. I am also the publisher of Strategic Media Books, which publishes the best in crime fiction and nonfiction. We are proud to announce the publication of George Hassett's Gangsters of Boston, the first comprehensive account of 3 centuries of thug life in the city where America began. In chilling new detail, veteran Boston journalist George Hassett reveals the city's legendary crime stories, from Prohibition to how the Kennedy family made its money, to the Irish Gang War, to the life and times of the infamous Whitey Bulger. Gangsters of Boston is easy to get. The book is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, your local bookstores, and at the publisher's website. The book is also available in ebook format. For further information on the Gangsters of Boston and other great books, go to www.strategicmediabooks.com. We hope you enjoy Gangsters of Boston.
In Ethical Empowerment, Virtue Beyond the Paradigms, Arthur D. Schwartz presents an ethical theory that is a framework for evaluating moral conundrums that go beyond legalistic rulemaking, dogmatism, and preconditioned thinking. The book is as much an ethical framework for unconventional ideas as it is for staying with convention. Ethical Empowerment is a manifesto of non-doctrinaire perspective. Ultimately, the hypnotic thinking of ideology and dogmatism can only be overcome by returning to the true source and essence of morality, which is nothing less than universal love. Discover how the philosophically liberating approach of the ethical empowerment can be applied to the range of ethical, social, and political controversy. Read about a plan to eliminate all political parties. Entertain the possibility of an overhaul of the patent system and its replacement with a system that rewards inventors while eliminating monopolistic control of patents and technological suppression. Many other transformative ideas are discussed in the book, including issues related to the monetary system, real estate, scientific paradigms, and a rational approach to conspiracy theory. While ethical empowerment will challenge your mind to consider new perspectives, the ethical challenge is always to keep the diversity, depth, and breadth of perspective within the boundaries of love. Ethical Empowerment is available at Amazon.com and most online booksellers in both print and e-book editions.
This is George Thorogood of the Destroyers, and you're listening to ArtistFirst Radio.
You are listening to Philosophic Perspectives on the ArtistFirst Radio Network. Back to your host, Arthur D. Schwartz.
And we're back. So we left after I was trying to sum up a little bit what Fred was saying and talking about the subject of detachment, or I should say attachment and detachment. Personally, I think they both have their positive aspects, but when it comes to the self, the idea of detachment is, I think, possibly quite illuminating by way of of exclusion. So once you detach from this, you detach from that. You detach from material possessions. You detach from jealousies, emotions. You detach from unnecessary wants. You detach even from pain. So the question is, do we begin to approach an understanding of the self? I'd like to just throw in something, and I'm going to turn this over to Fred here in a minute, that I think is aligned with this. I can't find who said this. I would like to take credit for it, but I didn't. It's not me, but I can't find the author of it. But I love this this statement that a man does not come to know himself until he's lost everything. If someone, by the way, if someone knows who actually did author that, let me know. By the way, you can contact me during the show or afterwards at radio at arthurdschwartz.com. But this idea of losing, you don't come to know yourself until you lost everything. I think that is very much in tune with the notion of detachment. What do you think, Fred?
Yeah, I think so. I think that when we can let go, and in a Taoist context, and from Lao Tzu in the Tao Te Ching, there's this concept of if you want to be given everything, give everything up, and it's not an empty phrase. It's right. Meaning really let it all go.
Right.
There's been so many stories of people that feel a great liberation, almost like an instant enlightenment, or a Japanese term would be satori, when they have a near-death experience. That they feel that death is imminent. It's just going to happen, and they're euphoric because they're able to let go of everything. Because what else can you do? It's they feel that it's moments from being over. So I think there is a liberation in that, and I also liked what you were saying in terms of trying to understand the self by through process of elimination. There are so many times where the mystics or thinkers or philosophers in the ancients would try to understand what something ineffable is by at least having some detail on what it's not.
Right.
In in Hindu texts and even in some Christian mystic texts, they'll talk about God, and they won't try to ever describe what God is. Basically, the best they can do is describe what God is not. Mm-hmm. And that's the way they think to do it. And I think when we try to get a real notion of the self that we've been talking about, that maybe a process of elimination is the best that we can do.
Yeah, that was actually a great point, Fred, because I am familiar with proofs to the existence of God in terms of God is what God is not. I don't know if it was Saint Anselm, but I know that a lot of those medieval philosophers dealt with that kind of argumentation, and I never actually thought of it in conjunction with this argument about the self. But when you think about it, isn't it really quite apropos? Because when you're talking about the self, at least in the metaphysical level, and I think that's what we're doing here, when you start with the process of elimination and you take away all the things that we consider part of life, everyday life, except other than utter existence, that it does come back to that ineffable. It comes back to that spiritual. It comes back to that basic essence of the being itself. And whether it's a superior being or just a humble human being, the logic is the same. So that was actually, thank you for that, because I actually never quite connected those two. And I think that is the case. I'll tell you what I think, though. That's saying a man does not come to know himself until he's lost everything, and so that's a way. And you could look at that as being, detachment in the unwilling attachment through a disaster, crisis. They talked about the Great Depression. People were jumping out of the windows because they lost everything, and other people, of course, didn't, and they lived another day, and they were successful ultimately. But the thing is, you can, you come to know yourself when you've lost everything, because what's left? It's your authenticity. It's your basic integrity. It's your basic decency. It's the basic autonomy that you have as a being. And that might be different than it may not, the difference may not be because I have a bigger car than you, or this is the way this person looks or that person looks, or this is how much money you have, or what you've accomplished in life. It may go even beyond accomplishing in material ways. It may go beyond that to the basic essence of your integrity that transcends the actual doing. Maybe that, to go on to another Taoistic subject, and I guess a Buddhist one as well, or Zen anyway, of doing by non-doing. Maybe that has to, again, it intersects with our subject of the deep transcendent essence that goes beyond any physical or even emotional state, but just goes to the core of what makes you no, I won't even say sentient, makes you a being, a living being. I don't know, that just kind of came to me, but maybe that, I don't know how you feel about that, but maybe that's what it is. Maybe we can actually talk about the distinctness of itself in terms of just the quality of your existential existence without going into material specifics.
I tend to agree. What you were saying about the Taoist notion of kind of a non-action, or just letting things go. I think that's important to being detached from these things around us that we might use to, and we might feel are what defines us, but really don't have much real value at all. There's a chapter from the Tao Te Ching. I'm looking at it now. It's chapter 22. So if you'll bear with me for a minute, I'll just read it to you. It's not very long.
No, absolutely. Go ahead.
If you want to become whole, let yourself be partial. If you want to become straight, let yourself be crooked. If you want to become full, let yourself be empty. If you want to be reborn, let yourself die. If you want to be given everything, give everything up. The Master, by residing in the Tao, sets an example for all beings. Because he doesn't display himself, people can see his light. Because he has nothing to prove, people can trust his words. Because he doesn't know who he is, people recognize themselves in him. Because he has no goal in mind, everything he does succeeds. When the ancient masters said, if you want to be given everything, give everything up, they weren't using empty phrases. Only by being lived by the Tao can we be truly yourself. Mm-hmm. So there's this notion, Arthur, and I think you hit it like right on, which is, really only by letting go, and especially of those very provisional things like possessions, mm-hmm. Can we, maybe get a glimpse of, who we really are, or let's say that more, valuable part. I liked what you were saying about the way people reacted to the Depression. Right. And some saw the loss of all their possessions as just being the end of the world, and others were like, well, I'll go on. And they did. And they'll live another day. And thank goodness for most of us they did, because many of them were probably our grandparents, So,
it's true.
So, kind of important that they stuck around. And so I think that where I know that for me, some of these Tao Te Ching quotes and other things from that school, the Lao Tzu or Chuang Tzu, all of these things, all of these really helped me. Maybe not to know exactly what the self is, Arthur, but to maybe have some examples of how I might conduct myself so I could get maybe closer to an understanding.
Yeah, I really agree. With the work, I do. I do in my day job. I'm a hypnotherapist, and self-esteem issues are very, very, very common. And you can see how people sometimes just don't see the forest for the trees. That they're really great people, and yet, for one reason or the other, because they are comparing themselves to other people, or they're not this, or they're not that, and they just have this terrible self-image of themselves. When what we're talking about here is that the true riches that money cannot buy ever is something deeper than that. It's just the essence of your being. And again, it's not a condemnation of money or material possessions or anything of the sort, but it is a condemnation of. I mean that seriously. I do think it is a condemnation of when we put things that are material above what really matters the most. And you know what? It's just like going back again to what you're talking about, what God is not, or what the self is not, as the process of elimination logic. Mm-hmm. And it's really, it's true. It's hard to express. It's hard to say what is. But I think it is one of those things that you know it when you see it or when you feel it. Maybe it's like, falling in love or something, you know it when it happens. And so I really want to thank you for this, because I'm just thinking of this right now because of our conversation. And I think that is a way of understanding, you call it the Buddha nature, or I would say, true nature. And I'll tell you, we human beings, we use language a lot. So we put everything is words. But there's something that comes before the words, and animals don't speak, and sometimes a person can't speak, and even when they say the words, they're not really saying what they really mean, and so a lot of wisdom and a lot of truth is beyond words. And I think when we're talking about the self, I think that's what we're talking about.
Yeah. I think that there's words can only take us so far. I think that there's so many things that it's a visceral type thing. It's a thing that needs to be felt, experienced. Mm-hmm. And I think that when we really laugh, when we or even the other, when you're faced with a situation where you're brought to tears,
right?
The reality of that experience is where I think sometimes you experience that deep true self. I've had a few of those experiences in my life, and most of them have been just really those kind of milestone events. Uh-huh. When I got married, when my kids were born, and I was there in the delivery room. There's nothing like that experience. Whatever problems you may be having during that time, or other issues, things that we tend to keep ourselves busy with all the time, Arthur. Those things just disappear.
Yeah.
It's only for a little while, but sure enough, they disappear. And unfortunately, this can occur too when the more negative things happen to us in our lives. But I think it's when those kind of wake up experiences happen to us that we get a glimpse. And I don't think anybody can teach you that. Nobody can write down, what that is.
Well, but I think with things like Taoist training, Zen training, and just good upbringing, by wise parents, you can see in people who really know what is precious, and they respond that way, and without having to be reminded. And the words are not sufficient. I really like where we're going with this, because we are touching upon something, I think, that really does almost go beyond words, and in some sense it literally is beyond words, and yet it's the most important thing in the world. That's an irony, because philosophy is all about words. But there's something called Wittgenstein's ladder, where you climb the ladder and then you throw it away. And I think Plato had something in one of his dialogues along those lines, I believe, where the words basically ultimately have to be thrown away. I really like where we're going with this, but it is time for another short break, and so we'll be back for our final segment in just a couple minutes or so. Stay where you are.
Hi, this is Gary Paul Corcoran, author of South on Pacific Coast Highway. Picture a hot and restless summer night, a sleepy little beach town along the Southern California coastline. The phone rings in Michael Devlin's downtown office. An old friend of his is on the line, having just been arrested for murdering his wife. Thus begins the tale of our jaded private detective slumming his way among the sometimes seedy but always alluring California beach towns. 3 more murders soon laid at his feet as he doggedly attempts to free his wrongly imprisoned friend and wrest a bit of enlightenment from a handful of better-forgotten dreams. Add in a cheating wife, a hard-nosed cop, 2 pain-in-the-butt feds, a couple of nasty boys from south of the border, a fortune-teller, along with a miniature poodle named Butch, and you have the ingredients for a searing portrait of life along the Southern California coast. Available for just $3.99 on Kindle and all your favorite ebook formats. South on Pacific Coast Highway. It's a drive down Coast Highway you won't soon forget.
Are you a person who enjoys intellectual social interaction and finds digging deeper into the nature of things, from big issues to everyday life, an important part of the pleasure of life? Social Philosophizers is a Boston area social club for those who desire intellectual socializing. It's a club for both singles and non-singles, and for anyone who finds intellectually mingling to be the best form of social mingling. The club offers a variety of interesting venues such as philosophical get-togethers in private venues, book discussions concerning literature and philosophy, topical discussions over brunch or dinner, guest speakers, theater, after-work mixers, even long philosophical ruminations along nature trails or city streets, and more. If you live in the greater Boston area or occasionally spend time in the area, you can choose a cost-effective membership level that's right for you. Basic membership is free. Find the link on Arthur's Philosophical Perspectives show page at ArtistFirst.com or just search SocialPhilosophizers.com. We hope you'll join Social Philosophizers today. That's SocialPhilosophizers.com. All past shows of Philosophic Perspectives are archived for free downloading. Visit the Philosophic Perspectives webpage at ArtistFirst.com. Back to your host, Arthur D. Schwartz.
Hello again. Well, we're going into our final segment, and I've really enjoyed this conversation with Fred Loeb. And I actually wanted, I'm going to put him on the spot and see if... try to put some of the pieces together of so far, of what we've done so far, and in our discussion, and also please feel the liberty to address any other issues that might have popped into your mind or that you want to talk about at this time.
Yeah. So I think we've been through a lot in our discussion of the self, whether it's identification or ego, something changeable yet at the same time immutable, something that tends to be easier to describe in negative terms, meaning describing what it's not as opposed to being able to describe what it is. Seeing that it can have a change or a difference over time and through the view of perspective, but yet I think we've all had this experience that we all more or less feel like ourselves. There's a sense that we have that doesn't necessarily seem to go away. I think as we've been going further into the conversation, what I've appreciated was what we just left with, which was, starting to get beyond the words. It reminds me of a quote. Arthur may have heard me use it before, from Chuang Tzu, which is, the fish trap exists because of the fish. Once you've gotten the fish, forget the trap. The rabbit snare exists because of the rabbit. Once you've gotten the rabbit, forget the snare. Well, words exist because of meaning. Once you've gotten the meaning, you can forget the words. And I think that the moral of this little tidbit here is that it's not as if words aren't important. They are, but they're not the only thing that's important. It's grasping the meaning. It's never losing touch with the the real substance, the real essence of something, as opposed to what we call it. And this, leads me somewhat into the descriptions that you might get through some Buddhist texts, from the Prajna Paramita text, the Perfection of Wisdom text is another way to look at it, where it's kind of a strange logic that comes out of that, which is really something like A is not A, therefore it's A. And what they mean by that logic is that most things that we perceive in our lives, if you dig deep into them, you don't find some piece. I can't look into you, Arthur, and find some molecule or some grouping of elements that I say, well, this is the Arthur molecule. This is the essence of Arthur. Basically, every one of us is made up of things that aren't us.
Right.
So leading right back to that beginning of, maybe kind of where we started off as the self as identification. So what am I? Am I, all the little bits and pieces that make up my body? Am I my experiences that I've had through my lifetime? It's really hard to say. But I feel that that's where I'm at right now. Is I always end up at this point. Right. I think having, whether I'm contemplating these things on my own or discussing them with friends, which is by far the most fun thing to do. I always end up in this at this point of not really knowing, but I think it's that not really knowing that makes it so interesting.
Absolutely.
Go ahead, Arthur.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. Okay.
No, I'm fine. I just felt like we, kind of comes back to that,
right,
to that concept of identification, right. And so what really am I? Yes, there's something to me that I feel has been a constant through my whole lifetime.
Right. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So I would like to actually make 2 points here. First of all, we had talked about the commonalities between East and West, and I have to say, that wonderful Taoist stories of the rabbit and the snare and so forth, and how you have to let go of the snare because you have to, just like you have to let go of language because you have it once you got the meaning. And so Wittgenstein's ladder, I think it says much the same thing. Of course, Wittgenstein was just as a 20th century philosopher. But it does show that the commonality between East and West philosophy, I would say. But that was just a point I wanted to make. But there's something else that I think is going to be probably my conclusion. One thing we didn't really talk about, and it follows what you were just talking about, Fred, is the idea of the evolution of the self. So I was saying, for example, you're an infant, you're a child, you're an adult, and you're in middle age, you're old age, and so forth and so on. It's the same person. We're changing. However, that is looking at clearly the changing of the physical self, the biological self, and trying to equate it or make an equation with the inner self. And but what we talked about before, makes an effort to transcend the physical self, which I really liked. What came of that. But even that inner self, even that more transcendent self, talking about who I'm, what you were just saying, who am I really, who is the self? Maybe that self is a constant evolution, and it's so when I talk about, for example, your inner integrity, your inner authenticity, your inner beingness, let's say, that goes beyond any kind of possession or any kind of emotion, that still, I think, can evolve. In other words, the spirit, you might say, to use that word, evolves. And so maybe evolution is more than just the evolution of a biological form, but the actual consciousness, i.e. the self, soul, or whatever you want to call it, that evolves. And so maybe the self or soul is not unlike a computer, unlike a chip that you can just write more stuff on. Maybe the difference between the soul and the chip, metaphorically speaking, to make the analogy, is that the self, in that sense, really does evolve. Chips evolve too when they make. I know you used to be in that business too. I think, and so they come up with new chips. So the chip, but in that sense, you make a comparison that maybe the self itself, in the deepest transcendent level that we're talking about, maybe that it evolves as well. And so we're evolving. So our self can be evolving. It's the same, but you might say we're the same as the chimpanzee. But are we? Well, not. Most people would say no.
Yeah,
we have one in common genetically with them, but we're not. And if you believe in evolution, we've evolved from, well, not necessarily the chimp, but from the apes. And so maybe the self itself, the soul, that whatever we want to, that inner selfness, is something that can evolve as well.
That very well may be, Arthur. I think that, whether it's the let's say Taoists or even the the Enlightenment thinkers of the West really thought that there was a perfection in nature, and so if we think about that, and we imagine that to be true, I tend to think that myself. We keep coming out, more and more people. We keep going. There's more and more of us, and we keep having these experiences, and maybe the forcing function behind that is for us to gain more and more. And I don't think it's gaining more and more cars, houses, and boats. Right. I think it's to have these experiences, and this is one of the reasons I wanted to bring up that Chuang Tzu quote, was that to go through that process of go through more words, go through more discussion, but then grasp the meaning and use that as our way of evolving and moving forward. And I think that and that evolution may not be a genetic one,
right? But
nevertheless, there's call it an evolution of mind, if you will. I really believe in that, and I do believe that there's a something that feels right about the notion of the perfection within the patterns of nature. And and that perfection isn't something where you hold up let's say a tree against a model of what that tree should look like and say, oh, this tree is just perfect because it looks exactly like this model. I don't mean that. I mean that there's a consistency to the patterns of nature, and more times than not, they work, and they work real well. There being over 6 billion people on the planet, I think says we must be doing it pretty well. And I think that if we can get past some of these, maybe the next level of evolution is to really understand what's really important, and maybe put a little less important into cars, homes, and boats and stuff like that, and really try to grow as individuals.
Yeah, I think and that I think we agree. I think we agree on a lot of things, and there we go. There's something that's immutable and unchangeable, but also changeable, and that's a paradox. And that's, of course, what philosophy is all about: to understand those realities and to try to make sense of it. Anyway, that's one perspective of philosophy, I should say. Well, anyway, I think this is another show to come into its conclusion. I want to really thank Fred Loeb for being my guest. Fred, it was great. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for having me. I hope to be back again.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. So this concludes another broadcast. I'll be back on the first Wednesday of April, and I don't have the date in front of me, but it's the first and third Wednesdays of each month. I want to remind folks that the links to the radio show and to my book and my other activities are on the show page, and you can also go to my website at arthurdschwartz.com. So this is Arthur D. Schwartz reminding you all to live well and think deeply. Until next time, good night, everybody.